r/AskReddit. Doctors of Reddit. What was your how the duck did you survive that moment? I was a surgical resident in a small town hospital. We got paged to see a patient for a spared piece of driftwood through the leg. We were thinking it was a nicked femoral artery and discussing if this poor kid needed amputation. When we saw him, he was standing on the skewered leg taking a piss. Turns out the wood missed every single one of the vital vessels and no fracture, just muscular damage. Emergency nurse. Once had a guy come in who had been cutting a tree with a chainsaw when it hit a knot in the wood and kicked up into his neck. Finished cutting the tree because he knew his wife would make him get rid of the chainsaw. Put a towel on it and drove himself to the hospital. Court showed no vascular damage, simple washout and home the next day. One of the paramedics who saw him said to his patient, "That's a real emergency. Why don't we ever get those?" Edit. Location Australia, Queensland. Not a doctor, but I'm a firefighter, so I see my fair share of trauma. About a year ago, we responded to a call that went out as an individual who had a car fall on his face. He was hotboxing in his garage while working underneath his car that was supported by scissor jacks. Something to note, the car didn't have any tires on the front end where he was working. One of the scissor jacks had slipped out from underneath the car, and the whole weight of the car landed directly onto the side of his head with no tires to stop the fall. We got our rubber airbags out, lifted the car, pulled him out, and got him onto a stretcher. After taking 2,500 pounds of weight to the head, he somehow got out of it with a fractured orbital and a laceration on his cheek. Every time I think this question, the answer is usually meth. One guy got hit in the face hard enough to let air into his brain cavity and was being an absolute asshole, which seemed to be normal for him, and literally asked, "Got any meth?" When I offered some pain relief. To my understanding, he recovered without any need for surgery. I was working in the emergency department when a toddler came in after falling out of a 3-story window completely unharmed. The sad thing was they were from a rough neighborhood and the mum hadn't noticed for about half an hour. Apparently the friendly apartment pot smokers found him, checked him over, and sat with him for half an hour, and when mum didn't show up went to find her. The child was admitted overnight mostly for social reasons, but it's just amazing how well kids bounce. Not a doctor yet, but I worked in a trauma center as a scribe before starting med school. Basically, I was attached at the hip with a doctor to do their documentation. One guy wrecked his car into a wooden fence, and a wooden fence post went in his mouth and came out the back of his neck. It was the kind of fence post that was double the size of his mouth. It had basically pushed all of the important anatomy to the side as it impaled him. There were consulting doctors for like 10 different specialties working on this guy in the hospital. Several weeks later, after he fully recovered, he walked back in the emergency department to thank everyone. I had a patient that attempted suicide with an R-15 under the chin. Put a hole in the soft tissues of the floor of his mouth, in his tongue, in his hard palate, and then split the hemispheres of his brain perfectly, finally popping out the top of his skull. He recovered fully. Not a doctor but paramedic. Once went a car wreck where a drunk drove headfirst into the corner of a brick bridge at 100 miles per hour. Took a huge wedge out of the bottom of the bridge and left the car about 1/4 of its normal length. All the impact was on the driver's side. Turned up only 2 minutes after the crash and fully expected it to be a fatality. Walked round to the driver's side and somehow he was fully conscious, but squeezed into the only space left in the car. Took almost 3 hours to get him out, and on extracting him out he had absolutely nothing wrong with him other than being a pissed up asshole. Still think, how the fuck did he survive that? Not a doctor, but a friend's story. He'd been feeling like shit for a long time, went to the doctor. Doctor ordered a bunch of blood tests and ordered them on a rush basis. The lab calls the doctor to bitch him out. "Why the fuck did you make us rush these tests?" Doctor is confused. Lab is like, "The guy is clearly dead, so what's the fucking rush?" Doctor calls him, tells him to not drive, but to get himself to emergency as soon as possible. Guy was a type 1 diabetic, hadn't realized it until way later in life, and apparently his blood work suggested he was a corpse, rather than a living person. He's still doing fine. Patient, not as cool as most of these, but I was puking for 3 days straight, before going into urgent care. I wasn't even going to go in, but my family said I looked awful, and I eventually relented. They said I had appendicitis. Due to a mix-up I didn't get operated on for over a day later. When they went in, my appendix was gangrenous and had basically disintegrated. Turns out it had burst/ruptured days ago. Normally, this floods your body with toxins and you die, but apparently my colon was positioned in such a way that it blocked that from happening. I was in the hospital for another week before my digestive system restarted and had to have bile pumped out of my stomach. All in all though, not a terrible experience. Intern year doing surgery, guy gets brought in for a gunshot wound to the head. He was working at a jeweler that got robbed. His coworker was black bagged at the scene. He gets brought into the trauma bay, and it's pretty hectic, because GSW to the head and well he's alive. Not only is he alive he's following commands but not speaking, probably from the shock. Cops are giving us reports saying he was likely shot with a .357 snub nose they recovered at the scene. So we do our primary and secondary survey and all this guy has is a single wound to his left frontal scalp, where the bullet went in. So the team hasn't really seen something like this before. Sure, a GSW to the head wasn't new, but this guy was otherwise completely fine. The decision was made to get a quick frontal and late head x-ray to verify where the bullet was before proceeding to court. Well, we don't see any bullet on the films. There's no bullet on the board or bed, or within the patient's clothes. The man was shot in the head and the bullet bounced off his skull. Court showed no fracture even. It was wild. Never seen anything like that since. So a common question I'm getting is, how do we know it was a GSW? He had gunpowder burns on his forehead around the wound. I'm a researcher rather than a doctor, but during my undergrad my anatomy tutor told us of an interesting case study. A woman in the same department had been in a car accident going at considerable speed. The seatbelt failed to lock and her face flew into the steering wheel. Her mouth, nose, cheekbones and forehead were shattered, yet she suffered no brain damage. Apparently, the front of her face acted as a crumple zone and the fact her skull shattered meant the cranial swelling didn't cause any damage because the brain had more space to swell into. She needed significant reconstructive surgery, but a year later she and my tutor teamed up in a research project. They used her case as a basis for looking into new ways to treat severe head injuries and develop new treatment protocols depending on where the skull had taken damage. They basically found out that if you're going to have a head injury, try and get hit in the face and not the temples, because you're much more likely to survive. Humans are like an iPhone, sometimes they can survive a 10-foot drop, and sometimes they break when they get tossed on the bed. Second year during my neurosurgery residency, woman got shot execution style, kneeled down on both knees, shot in the back of the head, think Boondock Saints style, by her husband, who then shot himself. In the air the patient was barely breathing and had a hemoglobin of 5.0. There was so much scatter from the metal artifact on the court of her head that we didn't know what we were getting into, but we brought her emergently to the OR to do an exploratory craniectomy. We made incision and took off a flap of this thick, mangled skull where she was shot in the back of her head. Her shards of skull tore a massive hole in her superior sagittal sinus, big brain vein, that we had to repair. We found some small fragments of bullet, but no big slug. When I went back to repair the portion of skull we cut out to access her brain, I found the bullet embedded in her skull. As we get older, our skull thickens, but this girl was young. She had an abnormally thick portion of her skull in the area where she was shot. After the case was over I looked back at her court, and it was a miraculous abnormality. The patient ended up surviving with no neurological deficits. She is a completely normal and high-functioning individual in society at this time. This strange thickened portion of her skull saved her life. If she would have been shot anywhere else in her head at point blank, she would have undoubtedly lost her life. I'm not one for fate or higher power, but this story always gives me goosebumps. Not a doctor. My dad, who is one, told me this story once. He has this 12-year-old patient, let's call him Tim, and everyone in the hospital firmly believes he's immortal. Tim was born with a bad heart and is constantly in and out of the ICU. By in and out of the ICU, he goes in almost once or twice a month. 9 out of 10 admissions, Tim flatlines. Strangely, Tim always comes back, even if you don't resuscitate him. I'd say Tim flatlined about 15ish times in total. It's at the point that whenever Tim flatlines, nobody panics. Not even his mom, and the first 3 times she fell on the floor crying. Hey guys, Tim's vitals are dropping. Again. Woo, that kid's definitely going for a record. Tim's pretty chill about it too. He talks about his IQ trips like how a normal kid talks about a mildly eventful day at school. Nobody knows how TF does Tim always come back. He just does. Frankly, I'm surprised the media hasn't done a story about it. BC, it's fucking metal.